Professor Roberts for that excellent presentation, for delineating evolution of Chinese policy, position, action, behavior with respect to South China Sea, how it progressed to a more assertive profile beginning 2007, stance taken by ASEAN countries, and whole aspect of what kind of role like-minded countries or stabilizing states, as you put it, can play in ensuring that China, in future at least, to a greater extent abides by rules-based order than what has been the case in recent past. Professor Roberts has thrown up a whole lot of issues, a whole lot of questions also that can be discussed further, including question whether China has already managed to change the strategic situation in South China Sea, whether is there any effective way where others can put together an arrangement, a regime which will deter China. Floor is open for discussion of these issues. Okay. Can we start with Sudhir?
I have two questions, Professor. You talked about the Australian change in stance on Malabar. It was preceded by an Australian change in stance during the tsunami, where the 4-country HADI process was made to 3 countries, Australia backed up.
Yeah.
So what would it take to create trust in an Australian partnership for this issue? That's the fundamental question.
Yes.
You spoke about how many prime ministers you had in the last 4 years. Which prime minister's position should we take as reflecting long-term Australian strategy?
Yes, yes. No, that's
so let's leave China out of the equation. Bilaterally or quadrilaterally, if 4 countries have to take a decision, what do we expect from Australia as long-term? How do we expect it?
Yes. No, that's a very good question. It's one that I must confess is hard to answer with any degree of certainty. I would start with the idea that the 5 years, which finished about 2 years ago, the 5 years of 5 prime ministers, the BBC at that point called us the coup capital of the democratic world. So anyhow, I simultaneously laugh and wince at the same time. But I don't think we will see that level. We still have some significant problems in terms of internal party factionalism, etc. But we also have a hardening of the public's position in terms of what they'll tolerate. Also, there were other distractions perhaps at that time, and at that time there was an emerging concern within various agencies, but there is now more of a uniform consensus in terms of a kind of coming together of perceptions between defence, DFAT, and several of our 6 intelligence agencies. So the advice that is now being given to political leaders within Australia is being much more direct and forthright. For example, on the issue of payments that had been made to certain Australian politicians, which had affected even our Minister of Trade took a position of something like $70,000 per month from a Chinese state-owned company about a month or 2 after resigning as Minister of Trade, and soon after the free trade agreement. Now, ASIO took that so seriously that they actually provided briefings to all the major parties just on what had been happening, etc. So we're actually in a very different climate in Canberra now compared to, say, under Kevin Rudd, who I think did what he did at that time. I think bipartisanship, even despite the factionalism, is more likely now. But maybe, and I saw quite honest reflections without going into details with the meeting from key individuals at the Australian High Commissioner Roundtable acknowledging certain mistakes and that particular episode in the past. So maybe the most concrete thing would be closely following words with actions, and that would be in whatever way Australia can meet India's needs at a bilateral level, and I've heard commentary in Delhi that maybe the bilateral is the first confidence building area, but hopefully as soon as possible, maybe even some form of agreement that's not like a treaty or something like that, but some form of tangible statement and public commitment that would even bind the opposition, or perhaps a joint statement in terms of the types of cooperation, etc., that Australia, in collaboration with India, would bring into that document. Something along the lines of perhaps statements we've made with Indonesia, etc., and agreements we've made with Indonesia.
I won't pursue it. Because I think the reason why I asked this question, you actually said it yourself. You've had so many prime ministers in such a few number of years. We've seen a situation where in the last 2 years there was a particular position your previous prime minister took, and we were in midst of discussions with a delegation from Australia, and that very night leadership changed, and we were told next morning that we have to now rethink our entire position. It's not really feasible to do long-term business on strategic issues on that basis.
No, I agree.
So do you expect, can we expect a much more comprehensive cross-party position in Australia, which is reflected?
I expect...
It will help build trust and confidence?
I expect, yes, a more bipartisan approach because of the hardening of our defence, foreign affairs, and also key intelligence agencies. And now you see people like Prime Minister Turnbull, who was only a couple of years ago quite optimistic about the potential China offered based on this hardening of intelligence, etc. Also, I think there are two prime ministers, and perhaps I should be diplomatic and not mention them by name, that were particularly abnormal in terms of, competence, etc. And that was most unfortunate. I would be surprised if we see such swings in the future, if, for example, the current Labour leader took control, or Malcolm Turnbull wins the next election. But our norm is normally leaderships hold on for 10, 12, 15 years, and there is normally much more consistency. So that 5-year period was an anomaly in the past 110 years. So yes, think of Menzies 20-something years, for example.
Just to introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Commodore Abhay Singh. I'm from IDSA. Thank you, Krish. What I will focus on your proposal about 8 Track 1.5 of stabilizer state.
Yes.
Essentially, you want to create a new body for discussion. And if one goes towards the proposed list of membership, these states are already members in various forums where their common position would be much useful rather than talking separately. And I specifically mentioned ADMM Plus and EAS. A common position of the countries concerned, who you term as stabilizer, in these two forums would be more effective than considering a new body. My submission would be that stabilizer states need not associate themselves in a new forum. They have to take a prior common position before these two meetings.
No, that's a very useful comment, and it certainly is something to reflect on. I guess my hesitance is because of ASEAN's centrality in these meetings, and because the processes have adopted ASEAN's methods, the room and capacity for actual action short of broad consensus. Maybe ASEAN recently, to overcome quite strident divisions, started to adopt some ministers formulation. So in other words, not all of us, but some ministers. But having a collective, tangible position in an organisation that also includes Cambodia or Laos, etc. There's certainly room for maybe some statement at the sidelines, but there's not room for it to organically evolve beyond that initial stage. So time will tell. The first step will be to see whether JIIA somewhere in India, Australia, etc., who might fund, something like that. But it's certainly early. So I will probably continue discussing with your good self and others for probably at least another year before trying to take anything further, if there's any interest at all. So thank you for your thought.
I might add, we have a trilateral dialogue between AIA, and ICW.
Yes.
So these issues are discussed.
I am Lieutenant General Gurmeet Singh. I have been on the topic of military content as related to China for the last 3 decades. In fact, I must compliment you for the template which you use of South China Sea to showcase that what are the changes in trend and behavior which is coming. Although your end aim was ASEAN is weakness and solution through Quad, I grant it to you. But what I'm looking at is that what is actually the trend and the behavior which I must take out of this template. To me, the last word is, in my investigation, is the behavior of North Korea and Pakistan scripted by China? Is it actually emanates and links to the behavior which it has been showing since 2007 in South China Sea? Second, I have been on the topic of China interacting with them since 2000. One had a lot of respect for their diplomatic aspect. One had a lot of respect for their long-term perspective. One thought that they are the people who think deep, their civilization and that type of thing. One had grown up with that type of a thought. And as an Indian, the biggest problem is we don't know our self-worth. So we want to grant a little bit more to them. I'm being honest in this perspective. So their method of communication has always been concentric circles where they'll end up the time is not right, as you said. They will talk a lot about the status quo. But unfortunately, I would say the template which you have given out and what is coming on the ground is the cognitive space of the Chinese thinking changing? Because the way the media has behaved, the way the think tanks have behaved, the way the diplomatic language has changed, it is absolutely a big change. One wonders, is it them talking about it? Because till now, they had one party line. They had a top and the bottom spoke the same thing. So my question is that can you detect these traces of what North Korea, Pakistan, and this cognitive domain shift which is visible last about 15 days of June, July? Can you see this content in this template also?
Well, I'll do my best. Maybe some parts there are a little bit, at the fringe of my expertise, and certainly in terms of the cognitive space of the last, few weeks. Just to clarify, were you talking about within China in terms of the think tanks and the yes, yeah. So I guess in looking at China. The 2 areas I've looked at has been the recent issue on Bhutan, while being here at the Institute, and continuing to look at the South China Sea. So 2 maybe narrow areas there. As to the last 2 weeks, I felt in terms of, say, the Global Times and certain reportage that I was seeing much of the same in terms of utilising those outlets to provide provocative statements. The idea that Pakistan can now invite a third country, in regard to Kashmir, So using that as a means to get people to kowtow, or states to kowtow to China's will through the threat of possible escalation or that things will get worse, but then having plausible deniability because it wasn't actually by the government, it was by a media outlet. In terms of North Korea, on that map that I put together, I deliberately listed North Korea as the buffer state. I think I don't subscribe to much by Trump, and I certainly think over the way he says, we need China to take more action, just makes America look even weaker in the way it's been done. But that's not to say that China doesn't have its role. My understanding is even in terms of the chemicals and aspects of the rockets that are now a global concern, that those materials, some of which have come from China. China has enabled a lot of what has happened, and it certainly is not in China's interest to have a unified Korea, whether it's 10 or 20 years down the track, that is pro other countries, whether the US or others. So that's hence that first phase buffer state. Other countries through checkbook diplomacy, Cambodia, Laos, etc. Imagine you have an economy of $6 billion, $5 billion in Laos GDP, and what a drop in the sea of Chinese money to buy a lot of influence there. So I definitely, in terms of North Korea, see that China may be concerned about how far North Korea has taken things, but it's also simultaneously enabled North Korea to do some of what it's doing. And I'm talking not just in a month or 2 months, but over the decades as such. Also, the US takes responsibility. The last peace deal, there was some issue with a Macau bank, I believe, and then all of a sudden they withdrew the next stage of whatever payment or whatever was part of the deal, and perhaps that was too inflexible, and it certainly sent the wrong signal to Pyongyang. I am very worried about what we're seeing in the talks, such as Global Times on Pakistan. And I'm very concerned about how much China is playing and exploiting its relationship and growing relationship with Pakistan, with broader strategic goals, and India being at the centre of that strategy. So I haven't myself detected, but maybe it's because I haven't paid enough attention, a distinct change in the last couple of weeks. I felt in the case of Bhutan and issues around Sikkim that it was more of the same as to what I see in the South China Sea, as an example. I hope that helps to answer.
I'll just request people to keep the questions, the comments very brief so that we can cover more people. Yes.
No. This is Professor Baladar Ghoshal, formerly of Jawaharlal Nehru University. I have one small comment and then 3 little questions. You mentioned about China did not devalue during the Asian economic crisis. That's a myth. Jomo Sundaram, a leading economist from Malaysia, he has actually looked into China's economy, for the 5 years before the Asian economic crisis. And there he proves that over the period of 5 years, China did devalue the currency. And on a small, short-term basis, not at one time like many other countries during that period. So I think the whole thing is a myth in many sense. The second thing is, the question. In the latest white paper of China, surprisingly, there is no mention of 9-dash line. It talks about core interests. It almost threatens other countries not to judicialize the issue or intervene or something of that sort. But surprisingly, it does not mention the 9-dash line. Do you think it is an impact of the tribunal judgment? That's question number 1. 2, China has recently preempted dialogue by other mechanisms by talking about a new mechanism that will be based at war in Hainan, and to talk about non-traditional security issues and also other issues related to South China Sea. Does it mean that China is taking away the scene from ASEAN-led discussion on the South China Sea to a new mechanism which will be driven by China? The third is on the code of conduct. The framework agreement has been signed on 18th May, but the whole thing has been kept secret because it's supposed to be accepted by the foreign ministers meeting in August. Now, what is your sort of take on this code of conduct, which is, I think, is going to be a China-sponsored code of conduct, which will only favor China's position in the region rather than anything to do with a real code of conduct? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it's interesting what you say about the myth, because certainly in terms of apart from the literature, the frequent comment I get in ASEAN countries, including Malaysia, was, for example, from Dato Johar Muhammad bin Hassan, at that time, or at one point Director General of ISIS, Malaysia, that we appreciated China. So they've solved that myth, and in many cases ASEAN has believed it. And I think my long-term friend Bun Negara, it was an example at the Delhi dialogue where he talked about the Philippines needed a moral statement. And I gave a question or a comment saying it wasn't a moral statement, it was a legally binding arbitral ruling. And I find it's surprising, not just in ASEAN but also in Australia, how much I have to remind people who are not focused on international law so much of that crucial difference. But even in Australia, the media report something from China, a statement from the foreign ministry, and nowadays less and less do we see any actual analysis of the statement. So how's the average Australian, for example, let alone people also equally in ASEAN, meant to decipher these myths from reality? So it's a good point. On the 9-dash line, that's interesting that it wasn't in the white paper. I imagine perhaps China feels that at this point in time it doesn't need to be provocative, because the one country that has been as a claimant state solid in its position, despite perhaps having admittedly some of the most difficult challenges as a country like India bordering with China, and that is Vietnam. But then you look at the Philippines and its change of position. We look at Brunei and its agreement on joint exploration. And we look at Malaysia and some bizarre statements even from the Minister of Defence, maybe the former now, saying, just because you have enemies doesn't mean we have enemies. Or alternatively, China is to be commended for how well it has managed. It is an example to the world, in terms of, and that comes from the Prime Minister Najib. But then with the one MDB scandal and other events that cemented a further reliance on China when there's warrants, etc., or potential legal from U.S. Department of Justice, I believe, with family members, etc., and we see a continued turn there. And meanwhile, might I just add also, talking to various embassies in Kuala Lumpur, a simultaneous disturbing domestic trend of the radicalisation of the officer corps has been discussed with me. So they have domestic issues, which can also undermine foreign policy, and maybe under those circumstances also reinforce Najib's need to have a ready credit line, to keep the country moving, etc. And so I am quite worried. I think in the case of the Philippines, in the long term, President Duterte's position may become less sustainable after the distractions of Mindanao, and the distractions of the war of drugs, and there's enough domestic analysis about the actual implications for the sovereignty of the Philippines based on President Duterte's actions. So we may see some positive shifts, but it will be a few years down the track with some of these claimant states. Brunei has been extremely successful in actually doing things without anything being commented on. So, you know, sitting on the fence in meetings, ASEAN meetings, etc., but also staying out of the media. I've written 4 editions for Southeast Asian Affairs on Brunei, so I've followed it closely, because only through seeing like a single statement by the Chinese ambassador to Brunei in 2010 alerting to negotiations, and then nothing until about 2014 about further progress, but you know, Spartan sources to get that information.
Good afternoon, sir. So my question is, what has been the impact of South China Sea dispute on India's Act East policy? That's my question.
So maybe in that context, and a very good question, that we can't separate, and it's increasingly difficult to separate the economic and the geostrategic domains. Partly because on the one hand, we have countries, and not just China, including the United States through the TPP, you know, deliberately linking the two together for economic but also strategic and increased influence purpose. And so therefore also for India, as it acts east and looks for economic, you know, integration, etc., the strategic issues are there, and I guess we see this through probably the issue of connectivity through the 4 various roundtables and conferences I've attended in the last couple of weeks came up about as much as China came up. They are the 2 big sort of issues. And of course the connectivity has its own strategic, you know, we see it in Bhutan at the moment, the roads, etc. Then India has its, you know, Asia-Africa corridor. And then there's Japan helping with potential funding there, and Japan has its own reasons. And so the South China Sea links in with all of this because it's also oceanic connectivity, sea lines of communication, and it also links to an example of it's like a crystal ball of what when everything is consolidated and there's nothing left to do in the South China Sea, because they've got, I think they will settle for 50%, but who wants to give 50% of, like if I own a house, why do someone come to my house and say I want 50% of it? I own it, so why would I share it? But that's what they want. In fact, the head of one institute, government think tank, said in Beijing, I tried to get their own perspectives, I left actually more disillusioned after my field work there than when I arrived, because this person said we don't even care about the central of the South China Sea, the so-called donut hole. There's no oil there. We want the exclusive economic zones of all the countries. And I said, but that's the part that's clearest under international law. And they said it doesn't matter. 50% of something is better than 100% of nothing. And I said, but no, we'll give you. And they said, but if they don't give what we're offering now, 5 or 10 years from now, the military will be so strong we take it overnight. Then we get 100%, and they get 100% of nothing. So it's that links there, and in terms of and sorry, just to go back to the professor's question on the Hainan island mechanism. Perhaps again a bit like what I was saying, sorry I forgot that aspect, my apologies, but I think that links to a bit like what I was saying with the 9-dash line, that perhaps China can sense that there's an opportunity to bring in countries in a way into a dialogue that it has centrality on. Maybe this is a bit overconfident, maybe not, but it senses the possibility of at least sounding out such a possibility. So I hope that answers both questions.
Yes.
Professor Vijay Naik, I'm a journalist. Initial remarks, Mr. Kanta said about assertive China. And in your presentation, you said coercive behavior is the word which is used for China. Now, don't you think that the coercive behavior has happened because of the gradual withdrawal of the US from the region, Pacific regions? Because before Trump came to power, the Americans were talking about Asian pivot. After that, when Trump came, he started withdrawing and he deserted the TPP actually. Now, the assertiveness of China or emboldening of China in this region has happened because of the gradual withdrawal of Americans in the region. You haven't spoken about that particular role, and what do you think about the future of TPP? Can it happen without the US? And I think the Australians have said that it can happen without US also. TPP, the other countries can come together. So what are your views?
Thank you.
We will take some more questions and then combine them for answers. Mr. Abai. Since we are running out of time, so I just...
Thank you, sir. I will be brief. Let me go back to your speech on the South China Sea. If you take a look at the last July's tribunal judgment, one is China is not a party to the dispute. China didn't argue its case, number one. Secondly, Philippines withdrew, you know it better than us. Then what will be the legal status? Secondly, the tribunal itself don't have any mechanism to enforce its rulings. So that is a complicated bit of state, judicial state. That is one part of it. Secondly, do you think this idea of stabilizer states is very nice to listen, but how many countries are ready to put the money? If you look at the naval budgets of the key countries, I don't think anybody can move beyond their immediate periphery. Whether it is India, maybe Japan may have, but they have other complications. Even your own naval budget, how long it will take? That is one question. Secondly, your ministers, the prime ministers you mentioned, I am not mentioning the names, but I don't expect everybody to be in the same boat. Finally, this is good, but in our problem, we are immediately sitting on a long border with China. So that is our issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other? Yeah, Patricia.
As someone who's followed the as someone who's followed the rhetoric on the One Belt, One Road thing, one noticed that it seemed to be out of the blue when the official document came out at the end of March 2015. Suddenly there was a South Pacific spur. So where did this come from? How did it come about? And what does it imply? What are the implications? And has any more been heard of it? I mean, how come that spur suddenly happened?
Good afternoon, sir. I'm a student. I'm more interested into Indonesia's role, sir. So my question is, what is the role that Indonesia is and may play in future regarding the South China Sea issue?
Thank you. All very good set of questions. I'll try to address each in turn. I'm glad you asked the question about the US withdrawal, because it is, or perceived withdrawal. It was interesting, I was at an Asia Pacific roundtable in Kuala Lumpur, and that whole session on Asian perceptions. And sadly, of the 4 speakers ranging from Thailand to elsewhere in Southeast Asia, each one basically said nothing. Just, I'm Trump neutral was one comment or something. They just didn't want to offend. Yusuf Wanandi from Indonesia, long-term, respected analyst, he couldn't stomach that. So in my session, he asked could he take the first 5 minutes, and then he lambasted, US and various policies. But the important thing here to note is that the Chinese assertiveness, and when I think of coercion, in an earlier draft this morning, I had assertiveness / coercion, just to shorten. I took out the assertiveness, but that well proceeded and even in some ways peaked under Obama. That's not to justify President Trump. On the military side, they're still there, but I do feel that they failed. The Philippines, even before President Duterte, if we follow the statements, etc., were calling and looking for an unconditional guarantee. It didn't come, not at the official level. Certain admirals hinted or whatever. So there was a circle even within the Aquino administration that felt what happens after the arbitral award. I've suggested that it wasn't as futile, that they could have done things like Coast Guard, policing, etc. Whether that countries would have agreed is hard to answer because they never asked the question. But at least that was something they could have asked after that ruling. The TPP is interesting. The TPP, I don't even know, and I'll be quite forthright here, if President Trump even realizes beyond the economic side, the strategic implications, but also the political implications. I did a report, if I might speak openly, to use a case study on multilateralism, etc., covered the political, economic, etc., and this is in the case of working with the Vietnamese government. And the Vietnamese were very transparent in talking about that the TPP was so comprehensive that it would have been served as an inducement for the type of economic reforms, etc., that in its absence it may have been difficult to galvanize all the agencies to do. In the process of greater economic transparency, reform of state-owned enterprises, etc. I don't necessarily agree with the end, and I said this in my report, with ending state-owned enterprises. There would have also been political reforms. So, America is all so much about, I hesitate to use the word democracy, but at least a greater effectiveness of governance, efficiency of governance, etc., and simultaneously undermine their moral authority in terms of all those fields. So there is a gap there. The military is still there, but they still haven't acted quite enough. In terms of, I've got something there about China not being a party. China was a de facto party because it had ratified UNCLOS. So, America agrees to UNCLOS, but never, at the leadership level, it was never ratified in Parliament. So it's not a party, but China is a full party. It did put in exceptions, but the court, through all the normal legal processes, ruled that in terms of if it was 11, it was all but one of the principles of law the Philippines asked a question on. The court found it had jurisdiction, that they were not part of what China had put on the exception. Now, one of the reasons I think it's quite insightful, that question, because one of the reasons why China wouldn't participate, and the court had to appoint people in China's place to give the alternative arguments, is because I think at the end of the day they knew they had no legal case to make. And so this comes up in one embassy meeting recently, but how do you talk about rule-abiding countries? China thinks that it is rule-abiding. Well, they may say that in rhetoric, and there may be some people, media, etc., that have swallowed drunk the Kool-Aid, as we say in Australia, that have swallowed their own propaganda, but those that are going to be realistic know that they don't have legal foundation for what they're trying to assert. With regard to the issue of the stabilizer states and the idea of a communique, stabilizer states and the idea of money. For example, there were two pillars, I guess, to my key arguments. That the Malabar exercises are extremely useful. They're already in existence. So I'm not really suggesting any significant expansion of costs other than, potentially a country like Australia actually gives a long-term commitment and doesn't think they can come 1 year and then disappear the next. In terms of the stabiliser countries, that's a dialogue at this point in time, what I'm suggesting. But if, for example, 8 countries came up with a decisive statement on that international law is binding, that non-militarisation, I know ASEAN has talked about that, but there was no official endorsement by ASEAN, for example, on the arbitral award being legally binding. And very few countries in the world actually endorsed that. So there's room for even just a one-page document with the right signatures and the right countries behind it, and also send a signal. And if China asks to openly admit, because you're acting the way that you're acting, other countries are feeling insecure and we're having to speak with each other. And that's just the normal way of international relations. They do the reverse and think that no one can complain or act in other ways. With regard to OBOR and the Belt and Road initiative, that's a very interesting. I only saw at a cursory glance, but I know Australia has been concerned in the longer term of increased emphasis by China in providing money, infrastructure investment funds, etc., across the Pacific Islands. And I assume this links to just reinforcing and giving some sort of official weight to that strategy. So to some extent, there may be some in Canberra that see a kind of limited encirclement through the eastern side and potential port access, etc., in the future through there down to Australia. Not that I'm suggesting that there's any plan to invade Australia anytime soon, but at least to have a presence and even monitoring or whatever. The interesting thing is, and it's still not in the public domain as far as I'm aware, but by accident last year or the year before, in Australia's proportion of Antarctica, by accident, an exploration team were walking along and found a facility. When they greeted the people at this facility that was being constructed, they responded in Mandarin. That was the 3rd Chinese facility on Australian territory. So, the type of directions that we are seeing are not limited just to the South China Sea. I think the South China Sea is the beginning of a pattern that is already starting to emerge in other parts of the broader Indo-Pacific and right down to our South Pole.
Okay, so very, very clear.
Indonesia,
Do you think that is right?
Indonesia is the
economic strength of China?
Oh, yes.
Sorry, one question was on Indonesia.
Sorry, I missed that.
Let him
Yeah.
ask
That
question.
the rapid rise, the economic strength of China is making it more again. And if he thinks it become a slightly emboldened stand with all this one.
Yes. It's well, as was rightly raised by one or two Indian colleagues, I think at the Delhi dialogue, you cannot have a strengthened military or capacity to exercise it without the economic, weight to fund it. So the two go hand in hand. And I think the interesting thing is, even if wherever one sits on the comments made today, if we just look at what the contingencies China is using from its economic weight and increased military budget that goes with that, the contingencies that it is planning for in terms of projection of power, not at a global level, but in the immediate neighbourhood. So the East, the South China Sea, and the Indian Ocean, Bay of Bengal being the priorities. And with regard to Indonesia, I think the question was what role?
What role does Indonesia play? What role does Indonesia play? What is it currently playing, and what can be its role in the future?
Yes, we've had a slightly unfortunate turn of events from the embassy perspective, Australian embassy perspective, there's a lot of hope placed on President Jokowi, and at the domestic level, I think much of that is still there. But he has a unique background, and in many ways it was a good thing in the sense he's not through the traditional sort of hierarchy of people, you know, like in the Suharto family and Megawati's, Sukarno, etc. He was a self-made person, provincial governor, then governor of Jakarta, and then moved up. So he's not seen as corrupt or whatever, but with that background, he also doesn't have a conventional kind of training or outlook in international affairs. So relative to, say, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono and Pak Marty Natalegawa, it's kind of chalk and cheese. They were so engaged in the regional affairs, but also at the international level through like Islamic affairs and issues or whatever. And we saw Pak Marty Natalegawa, for example, undertake the so-called shuttle diplomacy in the wake of the 2012 joint communique failure. He covered 3 countries, Cambodia, Vietnam, and the Philippines in 72 hours, and came up with like a 6-point sort of proposal, which he personally wrote. You know, I spoke to Kemlu, and he was like, no, I've got to do it myself. He didn't farm it off. Nonetheless, so maybe the current Foreign Minister Retno, is not also as diplomatically savvy as Marty Natalegawa was, but they have their, maritime access proposal, which kind of follows on from, predecessors, and then we have these relatively regular intrusions. And sometimes quite coercive intrusions into the Natuna exclusive economic zone. And there's been reports, credible reports of Chinese vessels jamming Indonesian Navy vessels' equipment so they can't call for reinforcements, and in the process have even forced the Indonesian Navy and or Coast Guard to release the illegal fishermen, etc., for fear that things would escalate and they were outgunned by the Chinese side. If that sort of thing continues, then I think Indonesia is still first among equals, the natural born leader, to speak of, use ASEAN terminology. Within ASEAN, it carries a lot of weight there. It can also carry a lot of weight in working with India and Australia, etc., should its position galvanise on the South China Sea. As a democracy, it is also changing in terms of its relationships. It is doing, there's no longer an arms embargo by America, therefore there's bilateral exercises happening. In the process of that, relationships are forming, and the mindset is changing. But that, to the point where they're willing to act or not will depend partly on Chinese provocations and the pace of evolution, whether it's a few years or a couple of decades down the track. That's kind of a bit of crystal ball gazing, which is beyond me at the moment.
Well, thank you very much. I think we run out of time, so we'll bring discussions to closure. I'll not attempt to sum up discussions that have taken place. Professor Christopher Roberts has left us with some not too comforting thoughts. One, that China is persuaded that no country or group of countries will intervene to help ASEAN countries defend their claims in South China Sea, or to persuade China to abide by rule-based order. And so far this assessment has worked out. Second, he assures us that what is happening in South China Sea is just the beginning of a pattern. So we'll see more of that. How do we deal with this emerging situation is going to be one big challenge for all of us. So let me, thank Christopher for the most productive session that we had, for his initial presentation, and very lively question and answer session that followed. So let's give him a big round of applause.